I want to tell you something I have never said out loud before. My name is Marigold. I am 27 years old. I have a job I worked hard for, an apartment I pay for myself, and a life I built with my own 2 hands. And on Christmas morning last year, my parents handed my brother a $90,000 BMW with a red bow the size of a dinner plate, and handed me a plastic piggy bank with $10 inside. That was the moment I finally understood that some things cannot be fixed, they can only be left behind. Before I get into everything, I want to ask, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or your country in the comments. I love knowing who is out there. And if this story resonates with you, if you have ever felt invisible in your own family, please hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Because what I am about to share with you changed my life in ways I never expected, and I think some of you need to hear it too. Stay with me because this story does not end where you think it does. It was Christmas morning in Portland, Oregon. The kind of morning where the air is sharp and cold even inside the house, where my mother had been burning those cinnamon candles she bought every single year from the same store, filling every room with the same smell that used to mean something warm to me. I was standing in the living room holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold because I had been up since before sunrise, helping set out the breakfast spread the way I always did. I was the one who remembered to buy the orange juice. I was the one who made sure the good plates were out. I had been doing things like that my whole life without anyone asking. My brother Icarus was 24 years old at the time, and he had been living at home for the better part of 2 years, working a sales job that he described as promising, but that had not produced any visible results yet. Our parents, Bernard and Lottie, had been covering his car insurance, his phone bill, and quietly supplementing his groceries for most of that time. I knew this not because anyone told me directly, but because I am the person in our family who paid attention to things. What I did not know until that morning was what they had planned for Christmas. Bernard walked Icarus outside with his hands over his eyes, the way you do with a child, while Lottie held the front door open and a couple of neighbors from across the street had apparently been invited to witness the moment. I followed because I did not know what else to do. And then I saw it. Parked in the driveway, gleaming even in the flat grey Oregon winter light, was a brand new black BMW. There was a bow on it. A real bow, the kind that costs as much as some people spend on an actual gift. Bernard put his hand on Icarus's back and said something about how every man needs a vehicle that tells the world he means business. The neighbors made sounds of amazement. Lottie was smiling the biggest smile I had seen on her face in years. Icarus laughed and pulled out his phone to take pictures. Nobody asked me to be in any of them. I went back inside. I refilled my coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the 3 of them out in the driveway for a while. Then I turned around and noticed a small gift bag sitting on the kitchen table with my name written on it in Lottie's handwriting. No bow, no ribbon, no wrapping paper with any effort behind it, just a paper bag with tissue paper stuffed in the top. I pulled out the tissue paper. Inside was a plastic pink piggy bank, the kind you find at dollar stores next to the foam stickers and the travel-size hand sanitizer. I turned it upside down. 10 $1 bills fell out onto the kitchen table. Bernard walked in from outside while I was still standing there looking at them. He told me without being prompted that the piggy bank was symbolic, that it represented my future, that I should be grateful for the gesture because it was about teaching me the value of building something for myself. He used the phrase, "This is your housing fund," with a completely straight face. Then Lottie came in and added that Icarus needed a car that made an impression because his sales work required him to look the part in front of clients. I looked at Icarus. He was leaning against the kitchen doorframe scrolling through the photos on his phone. He did not look up. I stood there holding that plastic pig and I felt something I do not have a precise word for. It was not quite anger and it was not quite sadness. It was closer to the feeling of a math problem finally resolving after years of carrying an error you could not locate. Everything adding up to a number you did not want to see but could not argue with. Because here is what that moment unlocked. Every memory I had been quietly organizing in the back of my mind for 27 years came forward at once, laid out in a row, impossible to look away from. My college graduation. I had earned a full merit scholarship to a university 4 states away, something I worked toward from the age of 14 because I understood early that no one in my family was setting money aside for my education. I crossed that stage on a May afternoon in front of 3,000 people. Bernard and Lottie were not there. Icarus had a recreational soccer tournament that same weekend and they had already committed to driving him. I found out about the conflict 2 weeks before graduation when I called to confirm their travel plans. My mother told me she was sure I understood. I told her I did not. My first job offer. I was 22, freshly graduated, and I called home from a parking lot because I was too excited to wait until I got back to my apartment. Lottie picked up. I told her I had gotten an offer from a project management firm in Seattle. She said that was great, honey, and then spent the next 6 minutes telling me about a B+ Icarus had received on a history paper and how his teacher had written encouraging comments in the margins. The year I got a chest infection that kept me in bed for 4 days. I lived alone. I asked if one of them could drive me to an urgent care clinic because I did not feel safe driving myself. Bernard said they were both too busy that week. 3 days later, they drove 4 hours to help Icarus move a couch and some boxes into a new apartment because he had asked. My 25th birthday, I received a card. Inside it, someone had written a joke where the signature line was the name of the family dog. There was no gift. There was no plan for dinner. There was no phone call until almost 9 in the evening. Icarus's 22nd birthday had involved a catered party in the backyard with a rented speaker setup and a photo booth. I had told myself stories about all of these moments for years. I told myself that my parents showed love in different ways, that Icarus needed more support because he struggled more, that I should be proud of my independence rather than resentful of it. I had become very skilled at converting my own pain into something that looked like maturity. Standing in that kitchen on Christmas morning with $10 in one hand and a plastic pig in the other, I ran out of stories. I set the piggy bank down on the counter very carefully. I did not slam it, I did not throw it. I placed it there with a kind of deliberateness that felt like closing a door. Then I went upstairs. I pulled my suitcase out from under the bed. I folded my clothes with the specific precision of someone keeping their hands occupied so their mind does not collapse. I packed my toiletries. I packed my laptop and my chargers. I packed the book I had been reading and the journal I had been keeping for 3 years. By 2 in the morning, the house was completely quiet. The Christmas lights Bernard had strung along the gutters were still on, blinking in the slow pattern Lottie always set them to. I carried my bags downstairs in 2 trips. I set my house key on the kitchen counter next to the piggy bank. I wrote no note because there was nothing I wanted to say yet that would come out the right way. I walked out to my car, my own car, a used Honda I had bought and registered entirely in my own name 3 years earlier, and I drove away into the beginning of a snow. There is a particular quality to driving alone at 2 in the morning through falling snow that I had never experienced before that night, and that I have not been able to fully describe to anyone since. The world outside the windshield looks like something between a dream and a held breath. The road exists only as far as the headlights reach. Everything beyond that is white and dark at the same time. I had no specific destination. I knew the general direction I was heading, south and west, away from Portland. Away from the house with the cinnamon candles and the BMW in the driveway, but I had not made a plan. Planning felt like the wrong energy for what I was doing. What I was doing required something more like forward motion and faith that the road would keep going. The radio was running a late-night countdown special, playing songs from the year that was ending. I recognized most of them. I had heard them in grocery stores and waiting rooms and through the wall of a coffee shop I used to go to. Hearing them now, alone on a highway in the snow, they sounded completely different, like music you hear at a party and then find on a record in a quiet room years later. My phone lit up on the passenger seat before I had been driving an hour. Bernard, I let it ring. He called again. On the 3rd call, something made me pick up not hope and not softness, but a specific curiosity about what he would lead with, whether his first words would be about where I was, whether he would ask if I was safe on the road in the snow. He did not ask if I was safe. The first thing he said was that he needed to know if I had paid the electricity bill before I left, because he could not remember if I had managed the account that month. He said it in the calm, slightly irritated tone of someone who finds it reasonable to ask that question in that moment. I told him I was fine, thank you for checking, and I ended the call. 20 minutes later, Lottie sent a text message asking whether I had remembered to close the garage door properly before I drove out. I put the phone face down on the seat and kept driving. The miles accumulated the way long thoughts do. I found myself going back through the years in a way I usually avoided because I had always told myself that revisiting old grievances was unproductive. But there in the dark with no one to perform composure for, the inventory came anyway. I thought about being 14 and buying my own school supplies for the first time with money I had earned babysitting the neighbours' children, because Bernard and Lottie had spent the back-to-school budget on new lacrosse equipment for Icarus. I thought about learning not to bring friends home after a certain age, because Bernard would spend entire dinners talking about Icarus's athletic accomplishments until my friends started giving me looks I did not know how to respond to. I thought about the habit I had developed in my early 20s of not mentioning my own work achievements in family conversations, because any accomplishment I named would somehow, within 3 or 4 exchanges, become a conversation about something Icarus was attempting or hopping to do. I thought about how I had become so good at not needing things from them that I had started to believe my own performance. I had told the story of my independence to myself so many times that I had almost forgotten it was a story I constructed because the alternative, admitting how much the deprivation cost me, was too destabilizing to look at directly. Around 4 in the morning, parked in a gas station lot somewhere south of Salem with the engine running to keep warm, my phone rang again. This time it was Nerissa. Nerissa was my closest friend, someone I had known since we were both 20 and working the same terrible restaurant job in college. She was now a night shift nurse in San Francisco, and she was calling because she was finishing her shift and had seen a message I had sent her several hours earlier that simply said, "Left," with no further context. She knew enough to call immediately. I told her everything, not in a careful, organized way, in the way you talk when you have been holding something for a very long time and someone you trust hands you a space large enough to put it down in. I told her about the BMW and the piggy bank and the $10. I told her about the phone call where Bernard asked about the electricity bill. I told her about the garage door text. I told her about standing in the kitchen and finally running the real math on 27 years. Nerissa did not say, "Are you sure you are not overreacting?" She did not say, "But they are still your parents." She said, "Come to San Francisco. My cooch is yours tonight and we will figure out the rest in the morning." That offer, the complete, unconditional simplicity of it, did something to the muscles in my chest that had been holding rigid since 2 in the morning. I thanked her and said I would be there by mid-morning. Then I sat in the gas station lot for a few more minutes just letting myself breathe. I pulled back onto the highway an hour before dawn and kept going south. The snow had thinned out by then, giving way to the kind of cold, clear air that makes everything look slightly more defined than usual. I stopped at an all-night diner in a town small enough that I have since been unable to identify it on a map. The kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that comes without you asking. The man working that shift was named Jareth. He was somewhere in his 60s, with the kind of unhurried manner that suggested he had long since stopped being impressed or alarmed by anything that walked through a door at 5 in the morning. He brought my coffee, took my order for eggs and toast, and left me alone with my thoughts, which was exactly what I needed. At some point, I must have laughed at something, the absurdity of my own situation, probably, the image of myself sitting in a diner at 5 in the morning on Christmas, driving away from a family that asked about a garage door before asking if I was alive, because Jareth looked over from across the counter and gave me a small nod, the kind that says I see you and I am not going to pry. When he came to refill my coffee, he said, in the offhand way of someone sharing an observation rather than delivering wisdom, "Blood makes you related, love and respect are what make you family." Then he moved on to check on the only other customer in the place. I sat with those words through the rest of my eggs and most of the toast. By the time I paid and walked back to my car, the sky had started going grey at the edges in the way that means morning is coming whether you are ready for it or not. I drove the rest of the way to San Francisco in the early light, with the radio off and the heater on, and the particular feeling of someone who has made a decision that cannot be unmade, and is only now beginning to understand that this is not necessarily a bad thing. I arrived at Nerissa's apartment at 9:30 in the morning, still wearing the clothes I had put on the day before. She opened the door, took one look at me, and handed me a cup of tea without saying anything. I sat on her couch and drank it. That was the beginning. The next morning, wearing a clean shirt and Nerissa's borrowed sweatpants, I opened my laptop at her kitchen table and wrote an email to my director. I explained that I was interested in a transfer to the San Francisco office if a position was available, that I could be flexible on timeline, and that I was happy to discuss further at her convenience. I wrote it in the calm, professional tone I had spent years practicing, and I sent it before I could talk myself out of it. My director responded in less than 24 hours. The San Francisco team had been requesting someone with regional project coordination experience for several months. The transfer was approved, effective in 2 weeks, with a note that said the team was looking forward to having me. I read that email 3 times, not because I could not understand it, but because I wanted to make sure I was actually reading something that was going the right way. Narissa, who had worked 4 night shifts in a row and was running on stubbornness and black coffee, took 3 days off and spent them helping me find an apartment. We looked at 7 places across 4 neighborhoods. The first 2 were too loud. The third had a water stain on the ceiling of the main room that the landlord described as historic and resolved, which I did not believe. The fourth smelled like something I could not identify and did not want to. The fifth was fine in every practical way, but felt like living inside a waiting room. The sixth had a landlord who looked at me in a way that made the back of my neck go quiet and certain, the way it does when something is wrong without being nameable. The 7th was a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building with a courtyard. The window in the main room looked down at an old lemon tree that the building manager told me had been there longer than the building itself. The apartment was not cheap. It was not large. The kitchen was narrow enough that you had to turn sideways to open the oven. But it was mine. Entirely, completely, with no one else holding a key. I signed the lease the same day. Narissa had been seeing a therapist named Dr. Pham for 2 years, and she recommended her without any pressure, just the kind of quiet recommendation that says this helped me, and I think it might help you too. I made an appointment for the following week. My first session with Dr. Pham was uncomfortable in the way that honest things are uncomfortable when you are not used to being honest about them. I spent most of the 50 minutes minimizing. I used phrases like it was not that bad and I know they love me in their own way, and I am probably partly responsible for how the dynamic developed. Dr. Pham did not challenge any of it directly. She listened with the particular quality of attention that makes you hear yourself more clearly than usual. At the end of the session, she asked me one question. She asked me to describe how I had felt standing in that kitchen on Christmas morning with the piggy bank in my hand. I did not answer immediately. I looked at the window in her office, which faced a narrow strip of sky between 2 buildings. Then I said, like a placeholder, like they had decided before I was even old enough to have a personality that I was the one who would figure things out on her own, like my independence was not something they were proud of, it was something they were banking on. Dr. Pham wrote something down. I had the feeling she had been waiting for me to say something real and that I had finally delivered. I started going every week. One Saturday in February, about 6 weeks after I arrived in San Francisco, I found myself restless in a way that therapy had not yet resolved, the kind of restlessness that comes from a mind that has been rearranging itself and needs something physical to do. I decided to bake bread. I had never baked anything from scratch before in my life. I watched 3 video tutorials, bought flour and yeast and salt and a loaf pan, and spent the better part of an afternoon attempting to produce something edible. I bought the wrong kind of flour initially and had to make a second trip to the store. I overproofed the dough because I got distracted reading something and lost track of time. The loaf I pulled from the oven was dense and uneven, slightly collapsed on one side, and when I tasted it, it was about 40% too salty. I ate 2 slices standing at my kitchen counter. It was the best thing I had tasted in months, not because it was good, it was genuinely not good, but because every mistake in it was mine. Every decision that went wrong was a decision I had made. The whole imperfect thing, from the wrong flour to the excess salt, was entirely the result of my own hands and my own effort and my own stubborn decision to try something I had never tried before. There was a satisfaction in that which I had not expected and could not fully explain. While I was building this life in San Francisco, Bernard and Lottie were escalating. The first week brought texts asking me to reconsider and come home for a conversation. The tone was parental and slightly aggrieved, the tone of people who believe that a request for accountability is actually an act of aggression against them. I read the texts and did not reply. The second week brought a voicemail from Bernard. I listened to it while sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, which is where I had been eating lunch, because I did not have a table yet. Bernard's voice on the message was controlled, but had something underneath it that was trying to sound like authority. He said that if I did not return the car, meaning specifically my Honda, the one I had purchased independently 3 years earlier, the one registered entirely in my own name, he would have no choice but to report it stolen. I listened to that voicemail 4 times. I played it once more to make sure I had heard the word stolen correctly. Then I took a screenshot of the notification timestamp, forwarded the audio to my email, and created a folder on my desktop that I labeled documentation. Inside it, I began saving everything, every text, every voicemail, every email, not because I was planning to do anything with them immediately, but because I had spent 27 years letting things go undocumented, and I was done with that particular habit. The 3rd week brought a call from Lottie. She said Bernard's health was in a difficult place, and that the stress of the family situation was making it worse, and that she needed me to understand the position my absence was putting them in. She said this in a gentle voice that I recognized from childhood, the voice she used when she needed me to do something uncomfortable and wanted me to feel responsible for her comfort while doing it. I spent that entire evening sitting with the guilt. It was real guilt, not performed guilt, not strategic guilt, but the actual uncomfortable weight of wondering whether I was causing someone harm. I brought it to my next session with Dr. Pham. Dr. Pham helped me trace the pattern step by step. She helped me see that the introduction of a health crisis at the exact moment a boundary was being held was not a coincidence. She helped me distinguish between situations where someone is genuinely in need and situations where need is being deployed as a tool to restore a dynamic that someone finds convenient. She did this without telling me what to feel or what to do. She just asked questions and reflected things back until I could see the shape of it clearly. After that session, I went home and turned off notifications for both Bernard's number and Lottie's. I did not block them yet, but I went quiet in a way that felt, for the first time, like a decision I was making for myself rather than a reaction I was having to them. 4 months after Christmas, a wedding invitation arrived in my mailbox. My cousin Vanessa was getting married in Portland in late April. Vanessa was someone I genuinely loved. She was 3 years older than me and had always treated me with the specific warmth of someone who sees you clearly and chooses to stay anyway. I wanted to be there. I also knew that Bernard and Lottie would be there. I knew Icarus would be there. I knew that attending meant entering a space where all of the unresolved things would be present and where I would have very limited control over when and how they surfaced. I brought the invitation to 2 consecutive sessions with Dr. Pham. She did not tell me what to do. She helped me ask myself the right question, which was not whether attending was safe or comfortable, but rather what attending would look like on my own terms. What would it mean to show up in that room as myself, not as the version of myself that shrank and accommodated and pre-apologized, but as the person I had been spending 4 months building? I decided to go. I booked a hotel room, not a modest one, not an apologetic one, but a good room in a decent hotel 2 miles from the venue. I drove up alone on a Friday afternoon and checked in and ordered room service and read my book and went to sleep without talking to anyone from my family. The wedding was on Saturday afternoon. I wore a dark green dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, chosen because I liked it and it fit me well and for no other reason. I felt my pulse spike when I walked into the venue lobby and saw Bernard and Lottie near the coat check. I noted the spike the way Dr. Pham had taught me, acknowledged it, did not amplify it, did not try to suppress it. Then I looked for Vanessa, found her near the entrance to the ceremony room, and hugged her with the full warmth of someone who was genuinely glad to be there. I took my seat. Several cousins and family friends stopped by to say hello, and I was pleasant and present with all of them. I was not performing calm. I had been practicing it for 4 months and it had started to become real. During the cocktail hour after the ceremony, Icarus found me near the appetizer table. He looked different from Christmas, not groomed differently, but different in the way that people look when something has been steadily removing the air from a situation they had been pretending was fine. The easy confidence he carried around the BMW on Christmas morning was entirely absent. He told me the car had been repossessed in February. He said it without drama, with the flat tone of someone who has had enough time, with a humiliating fact that the acute embarrassment has worn off, and what remains is just the dull truth of it. Bernard had co-signed a loan with terms that neither of them had read carefully enough, and when the monthly payment came due and Icarus could not cover it with his sales commissions, the financing company came for the vehicle. He was now working a morning shift at a local coffee shop and picking up freelance data entry work in the evenings. He was borrowing money from a friend to close the gap on rent. He said all of this without asking me for anything. which was the most mature I had ever seen him be about anything in my memory. I listened to all of it. I did not say I told you so. I did not perform sympathy I did not feel. I asked him if he was getting any support, any kind of help working through the situation. He gave the shrug of someone who has not considered that as an option. I reached into my bag, found a pen, and wrote Dr. Pham's office number on a cocktail napkin. I slid it across the small table between us and told him it had helped me and it was worth a call. He pocketed it without commenting. That was enough. Bernard found me about 40 minutes later, in the short hallway that connected the main reception room to a smaller library space, the venue used for private events. He was wearing his good suit and carrying a glass of something amber. He had the manner of a man who has rehearsed what he intends to say and believes his preparation gives him an advantage. He told me that my behavior at Christmas, by which he meant leaving in the middle of the night, was dramatic and inconsiderate and had caused real harm to the family. He told me the piggy bank was a joke, a light-hearted gesture that I had chosen to take personally because I had always been sensitive. He told me my mother had barely been sleeping since I left. He said these things with the confidence of someone who has never had to account for his own version of events to anyone who would push back. I had anticipated this conversation. I had thought about it across multiple therapy sessions. I had written about it in my journal and talked about it with Nerissa and sat with it in the early mornings when sleep was slow to come. I was not surprised by a single word he said. I was carrying a manila envelope. I had assembled its contents carefully over the past several weeks, not as a weapon but as a record, the kind of record I had spent years wishing I had kept and had finally started keeping. Inside it were printed photographs from my college graduation, taken by a classmate, in which the family section of the audience is clearly visible, and my family is clearly not in it. There were bank statements from the years I had helped cover household expenses during a stretch when Bernard's work hours had been cut, and I had been sending money home every month without being asked, and without ever being thanked. There were birthday cards from years where the effort was so minimal they read more like obligation than affection. And there was a handwritten log I had been keeping since I was 19, a record of specific dates and specific incidents, where the disparity in how I was treated versus how Icarus was treated was so clear that I had written it down in the moment, because some part of me had always known that one day I would need to be able to show someone. I did not hand Bernard the envelope dramatically. I did not wave it at him. I set it on the side table in the hallway and told him calmly that I was not at Vanessa's wedding to argue, and I was not there to apologize. I was there because I loved Vanessa. I told him that I had documented what I experienced growing up in that house, and that if he ever sincerely wanted to understand the picture from my perspective, the documentation was there. But I would not be providing the reconciliation he had scripted. Then I reached into my bag and placed the plastic pink piggy bank on the table beside the envelope. I had filled it before leaving San Francisco, not with $10, with a stack of folded tens that added up to $160, which was roughly what a $90,000 vehicle depreciates in the time it takes to drive it off a lot. The number was not precise. The gesture was. I turned the piggy bank over and let the bills fall out onto the table and told Bernard I was returning his housing fund with interest and that I considered the symbolic gesture complete. Bernard drew breath to respond. His face had gone through several expressions in a short period of time and had not settled on one. Lottie spoke first. She had been standing just inside the library doorway. I had not been certain she was there until she moved. She had been quiet through all of it, the envelope, the piggy bank, the spilled tens, and when she finally spoke her voice was not the gentle, managing voice she used when she needed something from me. It was quieter than that and more tired. She said, "I think she is right, Bernard." He turned to look at her. Something shifted in the room. Lottie said she had been doing a lot of thinking since Christmas. She said that when she looked back at some of the choices they had made over the years, she did not like what she saw. She did not elaborate, and she did not break down, and she did not make it a dramatic moment. She just said it the way people say things they have been slowly arriving at for a long time and have finally decided to stop not saying. I told them both clearly and without anger what I needed in order to begin rebuilding any kind of relationship with our family. Family therapy with a licensed professional, not a pastor or a family friend but an actual therapist. Consistent respect for the boundaries I had been trying to establish. No more using illness or financial leverage as tools to bring me back into line. These were not negotiating points. They were the conditions. Bernard said nothing. His glass was still in his hand. Lottie looked at me and said, "Okay." That was the most surprising word I heard all year. The things that changed after the wedding changed slowly, the way things change when they are actually changing rather than just appearing to. I want to be specific about that because the slowness was part of what made it believable. 3 months after the wedding, Icarus called to tell me that Bernard had stopped drinking. Not reduced, stopped. Bernard had apparently been struggling with a dependence on alcohol for longer than any of us had fully named, and the combination of the wedding confrontation and a conversation with his own doctor had finally produced enough clarity for him to take the first step toward addressing it. He began attending weekly meetings. He took up volunteering at a local food bank on Saturday mornings, something his counselor had suggested as a way of redirecting the energy he had previously directed at managing and controlling the people around him. The changes were imperfect and non-linear. Icarus told me about setbacks as they happened, because I had told him I wanted honesty, not a curated update. Lottie found her own momentum separately. She began volunteering 2 afternoons a week at a community centre near the neighbourhood she had lived in for 20 years. She signed up for a beginner watercolour class at a local arts organisation, which surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. One Wednesday evening, she sent me a photo of her first painting. It was a bowl of fruit. The fruit was anatomically questionable and the perspective was not quite resolved, but the colours were genuinely lovely. The text she sent with it said simply, "I made something." I looked at that text for a long time, then I typed back, "So did I actually. I was thinking about the bread." Icarus was building something too, though his construction was more visibly effortful. He was working the morning shift at a coffee shop, waking up at 4:30 in the morning 5 days a week, which was a significant adjustment for someone who had been sleeping until 10 for the better part of 2 years. He was doing freelance data entry work in the evenings. He sold his gaming setup, a significant sacrifice by his own description, and used the money to repay his friend. He learned to cook because eating out had become financially incoherent. One Sunday he called me and asked, without much preamble, how I had made the bread I had mentioned in an earlier conversation. I walked him through it over the phone. We were on the call for almost an hour, talking about yeast activation and dough consistency, and the particular challenge of knowing when something is ready to go in the oven. He called me back 2 hours later to report that the loaf he had produced was, in his words, basically a doorstop. I told him mine had been too. We laughed about it for a while. It was the first genuine laugh I could remember sharing with him, uncomplicated by the roles we had each been performing in our family for most of our lives. Icarus and I settled into monthly calls after that, 30 to 60 minutes depending on what we each had to say. We talked about work and about what we were cooking and about books, and about the small mechanics of lives we were each building more intentionally than before. We did not discuss Christmas or the BMW or the piggy bank unless one of us brought it up with a specific purpose. The calls always ended with a plan for the next one, which was a structure I had suggested and which Icarus had adopted without complaint. It was not the sibling relationship I had spent years wishing for, the easy, uncomplicated one that existed in other people's families, the kind where you text each other stupid things at random intervals just because you feel like it. But it was real. It had been built on something actual rather than inherited obligation, and that was worth considerably more than I had originally expected. Cale entered my life during this period, though entered is probably too dramatic a word for how it actually happened. He was a structural engineer at a firm that worked with my company on a joint project. I met him at a work event in the function room of a hotel near the office, the kind of event where everyone is holding a glass of something and pretending the conversation is more casual than it is. He was standing near the window talking to a colleague, and he made a joke about something that I did not quite hear, but the way the people around him responded told me it was a good one. We started getting coffee after project meetings, then dinner occasionally at the kind of restaurant where you feel no particular pressure to make the evening last a specific amount of time. He had an unhurried way of listening. He waited until you had fully finished a thought before responding, which sounds like a small thing, but becomes remarkable when you are used to people cutting in. He was curious about my work in a way that felt genuine rather than polite. He did not make me feel like I needed to be smaller or more certain or less complicated than I actually was. I told Dr. Pham about him during a session in September. She asked what I noticed about how I felt in his company. I thought about it for longer than the question probably required, and then I said, "Safe, but not in a boring way." Dr. Pham wrote something in her notebook. I decided that was a good sign. In October, 8 months after I had arrived in San Francisco in borrowed sweatpants with yesterday's clothes in a suitcase, my director called me into her office. She told me that the feedback on my project coordination over the past several months had been consistent and strong, that my team members had specifically noted the quality of my communication and follow-through, and that she was pleased to offer me a promotion to Senior Project Director, effective the 1st of November. I said thank you. I shook her hand. I walked back to my desk and sat down and opened my email and stared at the screen for a moment without reading anything on it. That evening I took myself out to dinner, alone, at a restaurant with white tablecloths and a wine list that was longer than some books I had read. I ordered something I could not pronounce correctly on the first try, and the server did not correct me, just brought it with a small smile that I appreciated. It was excellent. The whole evening was excellent. I sat there for 2 hours, eating slowly and thinking about nothing in particular, and it was one of the finest things I had done for myself in a year full of things I had done for myself for the first time. I hosted Christmas this year, at my apartment, the one on the 3rd floor with the narrow kitchen and the window that looks out at the lemon tree. I spent 3 days cooking in preparation, which was both excessive and entirely necessary for my state of mind. I made 3 kinds of cookies. 2 of them were good. The third was a texture experiment that did not resolve correctly, but that Kale later described as bold, which I am choosing to accept as a compliment. I strung lights along the window. I put on a playlist that someone at work had recommended, and that kept making unexpected choices in the best way. Nerissa was there. Kale was there, having offered to bring 1 bottle of wine and arriving with 3 because he could not land on a decision, which I have decided is one of my favorite things about him. 2 colleagues from my office who had mentioned in passing that they did not have anywhere to go for the holidays were there. I had invited them both with the specific instruction that the invitation had no obligation attached to it. My neighbor from the 2nd floor, a woman named Dot who had taught me to properly season a cast-iron pan back in February, and who had since become someone I had dinner with at least once a month, was there. Nobody had been convinced to come. Nobody was performing presents. The room was full of people who wanted to be exactly where they were. Icarus called via video around midday. He was in his apartment, the smaller, more modest one he shared with a roommate, a deliberate step down from the lifestyle he had been performing before all of this. He looked tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from doing real work over a sustained period of time, rather than the exhaustion of someone treading water and calling it swimming. He held up a loaf of bread to the camera. It was not beautiful, it was slightly lopsided and the crust had cracked in an unexpected place, but it held together and it looked like bread. He said, "3rd attempt, still a little dense." I held up mine. I had made it the evening before, using a new technique Dr. Pham's receptionist had recommended after a conversation in the waiting room. It was better than my previous attempts, but still had a particular quality in the center that I could not fully resolve. I said, "4th attempt, still a little salty." We both laughed, loudly enough that Nerissa looked over from across the room. I waved her off and kept laughing. A package had arrived in the mail 3 days before Christmas. A physical package sent from Portland with my mother's handwriting on the label. Inside, wrapped in layers of tissue paper that had been refolded carefully, was my childhood dollhouse. Bernard had built it in the garage across one winter when I was about 6 years old, a wooden structure with small painted shutters and a hinged roof that opened to reveal 3 rooms inside. I had not thought about it in years. I did not know they still had it. Underneath the tissue paper was a notarized document, formally transferring ownership of the dollhouse to me. It was legally unnecessary. You do not need notarized paperwork to give someone a toy. The fact that Lottie had gone to a notary and had it formalized meant she had been thinking carefully about the weight an object can carry, about what it means to return something you held onto long after you should have offered it back. At the bottom of the box was a handwritten letter, 2 pages, front and back, in Lottie's small, careful script. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. It did not explain or justify. It named specific things, specific moments, specific choices she was taking responsibility for, in the way that only feels true when someone has done the interior work required to see their own history honestly. It ended with a sentence I have read several times since. "I hope you know I see you now." I folded the letter and put it in the drawer of my nightstand. Not framed, not displayed, not performed, just held carefully in a place where I could return to it when I needed to. The plastic pink piggy bank is on my mantel, between a small succulent that Kale brought me in October and a photograph of me and Nerissa from a camping trip we took in the fall, standing in front of a view of the ocean that we hiked 4 miles in the wrong shoes to reach. The piggy bank is empty. It does not hold $10 or a symbolic stack of returned bills. It holds nothing, which is the most accurate thing it has ever contained. It is not a trophy. It is not a monument to a wound. It is a marker, the specific point in my history from which I can measure how far I have traveled. The distance between the woman who stood in that kitchen holding it on Christmas morning and the woman standing in her own kitchen right now, with people who chose to be there filling the room with noise and warmth, is not a distance anyone handed me. I walked every inch of it. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a few minutes before anyone noticed, and I let myself just look at all of it. Kale and Dot trying to help Nerissa figure out something on her phone, the 3 of them crowded around the small screen with expressions of collective concentration. The colleagues from work laughing at something I had missed, the smell of the cookies that turned out better than expected, and the wine that Kale had deliberated over, and the lemon tree outside the window catching the afternoon light. I thought about the girl who stood in a warm house on Christmas morning and felt invisible, holding a plastic pig and $10, surrounded by people who had made the same choice about her so many times, and in so many small ways that they had stopped noticing they were making it. I do not feel sorry for her. I feel grateful to her, for leaving when leaving was the only honest thing left to do, for driving through the snow, for stopping at a diner at dawn and hearing a sentence that clarified everything, for accepting a cooch and a cup of tea and a friend who did not make her justify her own pain, for walking into Dr. Pham's office and eventually saying the true things out loud, for trying to bake bread and eating the imperfect result, standing at a counter in an apartment that was entirely, completely, unconditionally hers. Your worth is not something you earn by being useful enough. It is something you claim the moment you decide what you will and what you will not accept. And if this story reached something in you today, if you have ever been the one in your family who figured things out alone, the one who was told to be grateful for less, the one who left a place that should have been safe, I want to hear from you. Drop your story in the comments, even just a word, even just me too. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what part of this landed. Because you are not alone in this, and sometimes knowing that someone else walked a similar road and came out the other side is the exact thing a person needs to hear on a particular day. If this story meant something to you, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find it who might need it. Subscribe so you are here for the next one, because I have more stories to tell and I would love to tell them to you. And if you know someone who is in the middle of something like this right now, someone who is still in the kitchen holding the piggy bank and trying to decide what to do next, share this with them. Let them know that leaving is not losing. That building something new is possible. That the people who choose to stay in your life without being obligated to are the ones worth building toward. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Take care of yourselves out there and I will see you in the next one.